digital revolution exploded with video games.
Gaming has developed as one of the most advanced forms of digital media.
I think there's a hunger to participate in media.
And it was up to the video game creators to feed the hungry.
Part of my ambition is to make the player as much of the designer as I am.
The players became gods.
They're omniscient, that they're all-powerful, that they get to make all the important decisions.
They can actually express themselves with the tools created, by these game makers.
For good.
We're giving you these powers.
And for evil.
But it's up to you what you do with them.
Presented by Best Buy, where this holiday, the wow's guaranteed.
1958. William Higginbotham invented the world's first computer game at Brookhaven Laboratory in New York. Tennis for Two. 25 years later, the industry he spawned was entertaining millions.
I think a lot of those games, the early video games, the most important cultural influences were from the time. When you remember what 1980 was like, 80 to 85, everybody was worried about intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the arms race.
That decade, in an effort to protect the U.S. from a nuclear strike, President Ronald Reagan launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars.
If you think about Reagan's Star Wars program, this kind of idea that there'd be a computer-controlled defense shield around the U.S. that could zap missiles as they came in, I mean, this really is kind of like a giant-scale avocation of Missile Command, which is one of the most popular games in the early 80s.
And that's quite literally about ICBMs coming down and you blocking the intercontinental ballistic missiles. But even that, I think, is actually a reflection. It's early 80s. It's when everybody's worried about the bomb.
Zapping an enemy at the push of a button was now as much a part of real life as it was in video games.
You could also see that the Star Wars program was part of a bigger idea that historians now look back on the Reagan era as contributing to the end of the Cold War by putting so much money into technology that they pushed the defense race so far that the Soviet Union couldn't afford it anymore and collapsed.
The end of this era and the disappearance of an age-old enemy also marked the beginning of a new world of video games, where designers could explore scenarios other than war and conflict. One designer, Peter Molyneux, brought a new perspective to the video game. Now the player could be the hand of God.
Well, I'll be honest with you. The actual reason it was a god is down to my incompetence as a programmer. Because there's one thing that every games program knows how to do, is called navigation. And it's getting a character in the game to move from point A to point B. I was such an atrocious programmer, I couldn't work out a way of doing that. So I thought, oh God, what I'm going to do is so complicated, I can't get them around these routes, they've got to find their way around corners and over. It doesn't matter, I'll just get the player to raise the land up so the little people can get to the place. And that was the birth of it.
Other game designers like Sid Meier and Will Wright also gave players a top-down experience with unprecedented control.
The term God game refers to kind of a perspective that the player has in playing at the game, that they're omniscient, that they're all-powerful, that they get to make all the important decisions. A lot of people don't have that ability in real life, and to give that to them in a game is really entertaining and fun. So games like Civilization, SimCity are God games in that you get to make all the important decisions.
To me, God games are interesting because this is the ultimate managerial game, right? So while we're all put in these positions in our jobs where we have to manage projects, manage people, and so forth, then, like, to kill time, we go and manage something even more complicated, like how to build a city, how to create a new civilization, and so forth.
God games allowed people to live out their wildest control fantasies. and gave players the feeling of ultimate power with choices they never had in games before. But the real gods were the designers who created these worlds. And their next divine act was to build a city.
I think that people are attracted to the fantasy of controlling systems, controlling lives, controlling the uncontrollable in games because it can be done, right? And in our real lives, there are so many factors, and we can't understand the factors, much less control them.
Video games began expanding the traditional narrative of good versus evil into games with more open-ended narratives, like Will Wright's SimCity.
I still remember it when that came out. I couldn't imagine a more boring premise for a game. You get to simulate, which already that sounds boring, the exciting process of zoning and developing an urban environment. What could be less interesting than that? It sounds like something you'd create for a college graduate course or something. But, you know, of course, Will's a genius.
What's so interesting about SimCity is its origins. In 1984, Will Wright made his first video game, which was actually called Raid on Bungling Bay, which to this day he refers to as a stupid shoot-'em-up game.
SimCity kind of evolved from Bungling Bay in that I was designing the islands that you were bombing, and I had to write a program that would let me kind of move around and basically create this world. So I was the one creating the world. The player would just fly around and bomb it. But I had more fun creating it than I did flying around bombing it. And so I took that part, that tool that I had built for myself, and then kept developing it. And that eventually evolved into SimCity.
Meanwhile, new political rules were developing in the world, but their outcomes wouldn't be seen for a long time. Therefore, video games like SimCity helped players understand the complex world better by seeing cause and effect immediately modeled in a computer game.
That's a big part of what is difficult about the largeness of our world and the interconnectedness of our world is that we just don't see the cause and effect any longer. We vote, we don't really feel that we had any say. We, go and make an effort towards, say, living our lives in a green way, but do we really see the long-term effects? It's very difficult to feel the sense of cause and effect. And these games play into that need to both be a part of a large system, but also somewhat in control of that very large global system.
Unlike real life, where progress could be excruciatingly slow and fraught with frustration, God games showed dramatic, if not real, results instantly.
These games are essentially about chaos theory or about emergence, the idea that one very small action can have very large consequences. The choices that you make through the game determines what the game looks like, where the game takes you, what the end scenario is.
The continuing success of SimCity in the late 80s and early 90s proved that players wanted intelligent games.
SimCity often gets thought of as the smart person's game because it became wildly, wildly popular among college students in the early 90s. These are people who probably hadn't played games since they'd had Atari's or maybe the Odyssey or played Space Invaders or Pac-Man at an arcade. And then SimCity came out and they were probably in college and they had a computer and they could play it. And so a lot of people who otherwise would not self-identify as gamers back into the fold of gaming through SimCity, which in the video game industry is something really, really important to have games that do that.
Will Wright may have planted the seeds of SimCity, but it was up to the players to tend this virtual garden and watch their cities grow. In the new age of God games, Will Wright was the leader in creating new worlds for players to control.
Part of the genius of Will Wright was that he understood to build simulations and that people were going to get into them. You start putting food in a petri dish and you watch the bacteria expand. That's an emergent system. There are rules, and you start poking and letting those rules play out, and complex things start happening.
In some sense, I really like games where I, as the player, can figure out what the goal state is. And there are multiple goal states. I can make my city the largest possible city or the lowest crime, and then go for that goal. So the player, in some sense, is being forced to make a value judgment at the beginning.
Players had control over whether their city would succeed or fail. In that world, they had the freedom of choice to make the types of decisions that people in the real world could not. The world's excitement about the end of the Cold War finally subsided, and people awoke to an endless list of problems and complications they had not anticipated.
The opening of the wall, there was this amazing euphoria and happiness, and people were ready to do whatever. They were ready to kind of share and give and take into account that maybe there's a whole lot of problems to be overcome. The installation of the political system, this changed, and we have a kind of an ongoing curve of dissatisfaction. So out of that moment of euphoria, you have all the political problems, economical problems in particular.
After the Cold War, the world was no longer clearly defined by good and evil. People were left to decide for themselves what was right and what was wrong. Into this moral quagmire came Peter Molyneux's Populous.
When Populous first came out, it was kind of the right time. There was a lot of talk about morality, and the Middle East situation was going on. Actually, Salman Rushdie, this famous author, had written the Satanic Verses, and he'd had a fatwa against him, and there was lots of, in the media, there was all about good and evil. I've always had this real obsession, and it is an obsession, of trying to, in some way, create life inside a game. How can I make these little people see they're alive?
In Molyneux's later game, Black and White, he gave the player the choice to be a good god or an evil one.
Look at them. Just look at them. These are miraculous creatures indeed.
They certainly are, but not quite as big as I expected.
Unlike the games that had come before this, you had a view of a kind of microcosm of the world, because you literally have a control that puts you in the role of like a demigod, and you can influence a people.
Okay, we're giving you these powers, but it's up to you what you do with them. Now that is you deciding what moral message, what moral course that you want to take in the game. Now, is that wrong for me to give you the power to do something? Or is the wrong the fact that you did it?
With technology improving, players would get to explore those questions at a rapid pace, in new and fascinating ways. In the new millennium, God games allowed players to wrestle with the same kinds of moral dilemmas they faced in the real world.
I say you're kind of a demigod because you only have the godlike controls that the developer gives you. So like Peter Molyneux's big game's called Black and White, and there you have little villagers that you control, and you have a godlike hand that goes over the woods and the trees, and you can grab trees for them and give it to them as wood. But if you do that, the villagers start saying, "We need more wood, give us more wood." They're praying to you. And so you have to go and grab more wood.
Thank you for this wood.
And the more you give them, the more they start begging you.
Oh, there's no food on the table, and we can't sell unless we're able. So we ain't going nowhere till we get some grain.
And that's part of Peter Molyneux's design. It's a kind of a statement on religion, is once you start entrusting your abilities to a higher power, then you start losing initiative.
Help! Someone help us!
Child.
We call to the heavens!
Every time they asked for a bit of food, you were there as their God giving them food. Every time they asked for mercy, you were there giving them mercy. Or, and personally this interests me slightly more, you could decide to be the most vicious, mean, evil God. If they're asked for food, you don't care. If they asked for mercy, that was an excuse to pick one of them up and throw them off the nearest cliff. And that sort of finding out what sort of person you really are was central to what Black and White was.
Molyneux also programmed Black and White with artificial intelligence, a computer application first used in the military during World War II to predict the paths of planes and missiles.
The big rush to build computers during World War II is for ballistics computations. You know, the whole notion that I'm going to fire a projectile up here and the Earth is tilted this way, and how do we make sure it lands in the right place? And those all used to be done by hand. And they said, well, you know, there's a lot of mistakes. We can turn this into automation.
During the war, a scientist named Alan Turing helped create a machine to break the German Enigma code. In 1950, he started exploring artificial intelligence, or AI. His so-called Turing test rated a computer's intelligence based on whether it could fool the subjects into believing they were conversing with another person.
The genius of the Turing test that Alan Turing came up with was he was trying to define what is intelligence, and he decided, well, okay, I think the best definition of intelligence is that if I can convince a person on the other side of the screen that they're interacting with an intelligent system, then it is.
The first video games were very simple in that there wasn't any AI. There was really kind of just an input and a reaction. As games evolved, developers added more things such as pattern-based AI, and really, it wasn't intelligence. It was simply that if you did that, the enemy does this pattern. And soon enough, players in Pac-Man would figure out exactly how the ghosts move through the maze and what to do in order to always survive. And once you figured that out, the games kind of lost their appeal as kind of being unpredictable and challenging. But as games evolved, clever developers came up with new ways of artificial intelligence.
AI really happens in the head of the player. If the player is convinced that, you know, this thing is intelligent or behaving in an intelligent manner, then it is. It doesn't really matter what's happening under the hood. And under the hood generally is simpler things than you might imagine. And so, in some sense, you might even call it trickery.
So we cheat. The games industry cheats with its AI, its artificial intelligence. But there's no question about it. Without artificial intelligence, even shooters would be poor, far poorer than they are today. What wraps up everything about artificial intelligence is the ability for the game to react to what you're doing rather than react to what I designed.
In a game like Black and White, players felt powerful because Molyneux gave them the tools to manipulate a character's personality, as well as his movements.
Now slap him by moving your hand quickly from side to side across him.
Architected the artificial intelligence of the people that you care for sort of with moral philosophy in mind, and they would behave based on different ethical principles.
Greetings, we're your conscience, good and evil, yin and yang, black and white.
There need to be something more than just a lot of little people to care for. I wanted there to be something that was truly yours to care for, and there was this mystical creature, and this creature really featured a huge amount of AI in it, so you could learn what sort of creature you wanted it to be. So if you wanted to make the most vicious, evil, nasty, person-eating creature that would go out and smash everything up, you could make that sort of creature. Or you can make the most kindest, gentlest creature of all.
Stroking tells him you approve of him, and it makes him happy.
And so the game really was about, given ultimate power, what would you do with it?
Gamers gravitated towards games like Sid Meier's Civilization, where the player became the ruler of his or her own empire.
The kind of inspiration for Civilization was start very small, but by the end of the game, kind of conquer the world, create a world that you had a part in shaping and forming.
Civilization essentially is about building an empire that will stand the test of time at its most simple. Who doesn't want to take something and build it into the greatest empire of all times, from prehistoric age all the way up to the modern day, and do everything you need to do. That is negotiating, that is buying and selling, that is dealing with ruthless leaders, that is dealing with other civilizations. Who doesn't want to immerse themselves in that kind of experience where you're always one step ahead of the competition?
The creators of Civilization, Black and White, and SimCity built digital sandboxes for players to design their own stories.
I think the most interesting aspect about games is the fact that they're inherently malleable. You know, every player is going to have a different experience, which is fundamentally different than movies, television, books. And I think that is going to be the really interesting area in which games expand, to where, you know, not only are you choosing your own path in a game that's different than my path, but the game itself is observing and learning about you. And then the game can actually start customizing itself uniquely to you, evolve to fit you, and evolve to entertain you, and be as personal to you as your dreams might be.
Having a sense of ultimate power was fun, but for some players, the ability to transform the game itself would soon become even more thrilling.
Cockfight.
Firing main cannon.
Son of a...
In the 1990s, a new generation of players was reaching maturity and speaking a whole new language to creators.
Culturally at that time, I think, you know, this was the generation that, you know, was sort of anti-establishment. It was a group of people sort of trying to find their voice and struggling to find their voice and struggling to find the causes that they cared about.
They were known as Generation X because they were an unknown quantity who rejected everything generations before them had embraced and accepted. Grunge music, with its angst-filled lyrics and punk rock edge, became the anthem for a generation seeking its own identity. Although they may have rejected the status quo, Generation X, also known as the third generation of gamers, did not reject technology.
First generation was people that literally just sort of appreciated games as a pastime. The second generation were people that really felt like games were, you know, part of the culture, part of the entertainment culture. And now you're seeing this exciting new third generation that are appreciating games as an artistic form, but also as a platform for expression, and feeling like this is something that, this is how they're going to express themselves to the world.
Before the internet revolution, video games democratized creativity by putting the power in the hands of the players.
What was interesting, I think, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, is you had individuals able to actually create commercial products by themselves. Over time, the games got more sophisticated, and it took a larger group of people, and it became a little bit like movies, where it was this elite priesthood. You had to belong to a game company, and then you could get to work on and develop games. But a funny thing happened in the 90s, which is that people created tools as part of the game so that people who bought those games could create their own games. They didn't have to be an employee of a game company. They didn't have to have a degree or some other mark of belonging. They just had to have the creativity and the desire, and now there were tools available to them.
I think that the current generation growing up is growing up in a very different media environment. You know, for them, media is this very malleable thing that they expect to be able to control. They expect to be able to, you know, basically make their own CDs, their own videos, and even customize, you know, things in their games. So I think that the games as a medium are probably going to be one of the most extensive examples of players being able to customize the experience and, in some sense, design their own games. Somebody can start, you know, as a consumer of a game and slowly customize more and more of it up to the point where they might be doing really hardcore mods of the game. In some sense, you know, basically creating their own game. So there's actually a very smooth ramp now from being a consumer of media to being a producer, whereas before there used to be this big wall, and the producers on one side would throw, you know, media over to the consumers on the other side.
In a lot of ways, I think that was realizing the potential of what the PC revolution was all about, which was giving that power, giving that great tool back to the people, to the individual, because those are the people who are going to take us in some of the more interesting and innovative and creative directions.
Everything that has enabled the internet to grow and these companies to grow has come by that extensibility and by personalization and all that. So, but early on, the reason these guys started out doing it was because that's who they were. They were hackers.
While some software companies discouraged hacking, many game companies, like Sims publisher Electronic Arts, actually encourage players to modify software into new video game content, a practice known as modding.
When you look at the rise of social networking sites, video sites like YouTube and things like that, if you can take advantage of people's desire to create, then they can extend the experience in ways that these companies literally can't. I mean, it would cost EA way too much money to create all of the types of clothing or furniture that people might want in The Sims. So why not create the tools to let the community create the stuff?
I've always liked that idea, and I've always in my games tried to give the users the ability to be more creative with what they were seeing on screen, that they were in essence creating the world, and the world was kind of pushing back. It's this very interesting negotiation kind of between the player and the world is like the essence of the gameplay I really enjoy. Most people just haven't had exposure to the right tools, and so I think we're getting to the point in software where we're giving the players higher and higher leverage tools so that with a few mouse clicks they can make something on screen that delights and surprises them.
I think in every game player there's a little bit of a game designer. I do this differently, I like to change this. And with modern games, we provide tools to change the basic rules of the game, add maps, scenarios, new units, really kind of design your own version of the game. And by providing that power to the player, we really multiplied the fun of games. You're not just playing my games, you're playing a game that's been designed by tens or hundreds of people, and that makes games a lot more fun to play.
By the end of the 1990s, nearly every strategy and combat game on the market came with tools to create custom characters or scenarios.
People could construct their own missions, amateurs, not professionals, and give them to their friends, and then their friends would give them to their friends if they were any good. And basically, you could provide content for an existing game with much less effort than making an entire game by yourself.
And then it became like people started modding the scenarios they wanted, which was like a lot of the times happened to be like World War II, for example. And then like the game companies would catch on because they see like this grassroots movements of all the modders changing all of their commercial products into World War II products. And I think modders had a big part in that.
Most of the most violent video games on the market today that sell are World War II and military simulations. And we might say, all right, well, World War II was the patriotic war, the war where there's moral clarity, the war where there are clear good guys and bad guys.
World War II was a conflict gamers could understand. Unlike the Cold War, it had a clear-cut battle plan and well-defined heroes.
There's something about the past that was so compelling, but like we had influences like Saving Private Ryan. And I guess people can call it like a righteous war almost. I mean, like seeing these movies, and if you had like a grandparent that was involved in it, like it would be like, hey, look what I'm doing, that sort of thing.
As gamers became better designers, they wanted to recreate more recent conflicts. And modders, as they became known, expressed themselves in new and innovative ways.
It seemed like there was this statute of limitations that started shrinking about like when it was okay to talk about these things. And if you want to talk about the timing of this, the World War II generation was dying off when we started making these movies and these games started being made. So maybe that had something to do with that being okay then, but then it quickly started shrinking. Then we started seeing like the Vietnam conflicts, then we started seeing all the desert, like present day conflicts after that.
Long considered the slacker generation, Gen Xers finally hit their stride with the dot-com boom. Millions of people were going online, and soon players from around the world were organizing themselves into virtual gaming networks, all striving to outdo one another.
It goes back to community. There's an incredibly creative set of people that play games and that make games.
Someone like Will Wright is saying that in the future, 60% of the content of his games will come not from his professional designers, but from the amateurs in his consumer group. He says the modern games are competing for communities. Whoever can create the most creative community is going to win. And this is a real shift in the ways we think about games from products to experiences.
I mean, the people would make it, and they would, of course, like, be intelligent designers and everything, but, like, the people that were really throwing their lives away on this stuff and playing it for so much, they would have a lot of insight into what they wanted to see changed. Mods would have a lot of these, like, common ideas, and they would improve it for, like, what we wanted, or, you know, what was annoying to us would get fixed.
In the ultimate role reversal, it was the players who now controlled the destiny of computer games. And they were about to take it in an unexpected new direction. If the 1980s were about the rise of the industry, the 1990s were about the players becoming a part of it. They were taking more and more control, modding existing games into new forms of entertainment.
Sometimes the kids make mods they put up on the internet, and they're better than some of the mission levels. And that's very exciting, because when a game gets towards the end of its shelf life, the way you extend play in the game and interest in the game, and of course all of the financial gain, is to let the kids build their own level. It requires that they buy a copy of the game. They can show the creativity of what they've done to their friends.
The smarter companies started supporting their modders more and more. They started to rely on it after a while. They would just have, like, the vanilla, and then they would let the modders come up with a lot of the other things.
I think at the time we were a little surprised that people not only took the tools for modding games to create new game experiences, but they also took the games and used them as a kind of puppet theater to create films.
Using a variety of desktop computer tools, players became movie directors, turning popular video games into animated short stories called machinima.
No, Tucker, you can't hold my sniper rifle until tomorrow.
Machinima, I guess, would be storytelling using a video game or a pre-rendered environment to tell your story. So instead of, picking up a camera and going out and shooting something live action, you can use a video game which already has character models, physics, lighting, and everything you need to shoot what the story you want to tell.
Basically what we do is we take a fun, interactive medium, like video games, and then take out all the fun, interactive stuff and just make it a narrative. It started back with Doom in the late 90s and Quake, where the creators of Quake decided to put in a gameplay feature where you could record your game so that other people could watch you complete a level quickly, or, how you killed the monsters or whatever. Machinima started as a way to kind of brag to other people about how great you were at a game. Kind of like a high score, but, a little cooler.
Without any computer programming experience, Bernie Burns and his friends Gus Sorolla and Jeff Ramsey made a little movie out of a big video game. Halo.
Hey, they stopped firing.
Why are you whispering?
I don't know.
And why don't you give me a mic check?
From the comfort of Burns' spare bedroom in Austin, Texas, his project soon took on a life of its own.
Well, I was a failed independent filmmaker. I had a tech job in Austin, and I really wanted a way to continue to write and produce on a regular basis to kind of stay sharp and exercise those skills. And so, not knowing anybody talented, all I knew was Gus and Jeff. I thought, how can I write and still produce something with these, complete losers? And so I thought, well, hey, we all play video games. We could probably use a video game to animate some of these stories that we do and just do funny little skits.
There's no way he survived that.
Turning the soldiers from Halo into film stars was easy.
How's that?
Who went on to say? All right, yeah, it's good. And then I can filter it through a very secret process so that it sounds more like he's talking over a helmet mic.
There's no way he survived that. There's no way he survived that.
Hey, that's movie-making magic right there.
But serving their demanding audience turned out to be trickier than they expected.
In the first week, we had probably, 1,000 hits a day, 2,000 hits a day. And then within 2 weeks, we were up to about 500,000 people coming to the site, every day. I don't think we were ready for the popularity right off the bat. Our server basically just completely fell apart. So within 1 month, we went from literally a server, just a computer in the corner of my bedroom, to 4 different servers in 3 different cities around the nation trying to serve this stuff out.
Burns and his team wanted to distribute Red vs. Blue to anyone who wanted to see it. Anyone, that is, except for Microsoft and Bungie, the publishers of Halo.
Hey, dude, the Jeep blew up.
No kidding. Thanks for the update.
Burns didn't have permission from them to use their game.
I remember we were sitting there one day and we were watching the hit counter, and we saw a Microsoft address go by who had watched the video. We thought, oh, that's weird. Then we saw like 5 addresses go by from Microsoft. I thought, well, that's weird. Then we saw like 30.
I remember when we started shooting the link around going, you've got to watch this. And then the question came up from kind of legal eagles, oh, is this authorized use? Should we get some participation if there's any money involved?
Pretty quickly after that, we got a call from Bungie, and it was one of their lead producers for Halo and Halo 2, and he said, we really like what you guys are doing, and we just want to make sure that you do it right so that you can keep doing it.
In the case of Red vs. Blue, the Bungie team was aware of what was being done, loved it, frankly, and the decision was made very consciously that regardless of what legal principles may or may not be pursuable, in fact, it was good for Halo that this was happening. The work was in its own way respectful of Halo, even though it was there was a parody aspect to it.
It's good to be back here. It's been a long time. Who am I kidding? Even 1,000 years doesn't make this dirt hole any more appealing.
And that's one of the cool things about the video game sci-fi fan culture is if people like something, I mean, they go full tilt to support it.
I play Halo 2. I play Halo 2 non-stop.
When it was released in 2004, Halo 2 broke records with sales of $125 million in just 24 hours.
Make a laugh? This is great, man. Halo 2, about time.
Red vs. Blue became one of the most successful examples of user-generated game content. Hollywood was finally taking Burns and Machinima seriously.
It was interesting, but when I made my film in college, I was like writing to all these film festivals and trying to get in and spend a year doing that. And with the popularity of Red vs. Blue, it's been kind of a flip where we've been able to go to film festivals and we get asked to come and talk about Machinima in general. We had no idea when we started all this that, we'd be kind of like at the forefront of a whole genre of filmmaking.
Releasing assets and allowing people to create their own previews for movies. And I think that's the wave of the future, and games have simply been willing to embrace that sooner than most other media companies. At a time that the recording industry is suing its consumers, the game industry is empowering those consumers to build and share content with each other.
Today, there is no way to stop the user-generated revolution. The best games do more than make the players feel like a hero. They give them the ability to create their own destinies. So some of these gamers began using the technology for more than play. In the new millennium, economic globalization expanded even further with the proliferation of the internet and mobile phones. Few people could imagine what life would be like without their digital tools, especially the generation of gamers who'd grown up with computers.
Today's generation of gamers has never known a time when you couldn't play with machines.
Players were also learning how to become the video game's designers. And soon, they would have the tools to explore all kinds of experiences, even ones that made the player feel powerless.
It's only now that a large generation of people who've grown up with this medium are getting to the point where they can now express themselves and use the tools themselves. So perhaps that's why you're seeing this interest in games as an art form, games as a form of expression.
Producers of real-world game titles, like Darfur is Dying, hope that if people could feel what it was like to be disempowered, then they might be motivated to act.
When people talk about the activeness of violent games, then they should also remember the possibility of enacting compassion or enacting powerlessness. And I think that it is very clear, for instance, that if one plays Darfur is Dying, that you can't see the situation of a child in need of water and not want to respond.
You have a generation of people who are very passionate about the world and how it works and what's going on in our world today. And they are also very articulate and very passionate about the game medium. So we put those two together and I think you're going to see a lot more.
Today, a movement called Games for Change provides support for gamers and designers who use digital games for social awareness. And this underground movement has poised the industry for yet another evolutionary leap forward. For although video games began as experimental amusements, designers and gamers have transformed these digital toys into a world beyond entertainment. A world that continues to change and evolve, even when the machine is turned off.